truth is, I am Iron Man.
Hi and welcome back to Easily Agreeable Reviews. Today I'm going to be taking a look at every movie to date within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's right, I'm going to review every up and down Marvel has had, and I've got something nice to say about all of them. Yes, all of them. So let's start at the very beginning, the one that started it all. Iron Man. I'm sure everyone by this point knows how much of a gamble this movie was. Casting a liability like Robert Downey Jr. was probably one of the luckiest gambles in Hollywood history. In fact, everything about this movie was a gamble. But again, everyone knows the story of how this movie came to be. So let's move on to the film itself. It's great. I don't need to tell you that. Everyone knows it. This movie is so effortlessly cool. It feels so slick and modern, but at the same time it feels so analog and old-fashioned. Imagine that's in large parts to it being shot on film. This movie pretty much made my childhood. It's most likely the reason why I decided I wanted to get into film. Still to this day, it's probably one of the strongest films within the MCU. Everyone here does a great job, from director Jon Favreau to Jeff Bridges to of course Robert Downey Jr. It's just a perfect melding pot of talent. Overall, I'd definitely give this a 10 out of 10. Releasing later the same year was Edward Norton's The Incredible Hulk. Now I'm one of those Incredible Hulk apologists. I think this movie is a very solid action film. Much like Iron Man, this movie faced a lot of production troubles. Sure, it's not as perfect as Iron Man, but I still enjoy it. I think there are a lot of fun and enjoyable sequences. I think all the action scenes are great. I actually really like the fight with Abomination at the end. I think similar to Iron Man, it has a much more analog feel to it. Sure, it's still giant green men punching each other, but compared to a lot of the later movies, it feels more grounded. Again, much like Iron Man, I think the casting here generally is great. You've even had General Ross return in later movies. I hope they bring back Liv Tyler at some point too. Overall, I'd give this film a 9 out of 10. Then we're straight back to the Iron Man franchise, with 2010's Iron Man 2. A lot of people consider this one of the worst MCU movies, but I honestly think it feels a lot more unique than a lot of the later movies. It doesn't feel bogged down trying to fit into a certain style or formula. It's just a weird movie featuring some of the best performances and best sequences within the MCU. This movie has powerhouses like Sam Rockwell and Mickey Rourke giving charismatic and scene-stealing performances. I think the Formula 1 scene alone is enough of a reason to make this movie worth your time. That scene has some of the best VFX within the MCU still. So overall, I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10. I remember how bizarre this movie seemed in the context of what else had released at the time. So far, we'd only had 3 fairly tame movies, and now we're talking about space gods and floating gold cities. And I think this movie does pretty good for a first attempt. It gives us a much more restrained feel than in later movies. It still feels like the characters being worked out here. But it does introduce us to a lot of characters who end up being better in later movies. So this one gets a 9 out of 10 too. And another movie that feels like the start of something greater. The First Avenger feels nostalgic now, although I do think a large part of that is intentional. This movie is definitely trying to evoke the feeling of those 1940s comic strips. But honestly, the best thing to come out of this movie is Chris Evans as Captain America, and I don't think anyone would deny that. So again, for that alone, I'm giving this a 9 out of 10. Now to where things started to get really interesting. Now I'm just going to ignore the elephant in the room and look at this film on its own. Avengers is great. I remember the incredible hype for this movie when it came out. It was honestly out of this world. Everyone in the world saw this movie, and everyone loved it. So did I. People like to talk shit on Joss Whedon's work now, and sure, his direction may be a little flat, but his character work is incredible. The way the characters play off each other, while also introducing several new characters, is honestly quite a feat, and I think there are a lot of talented writers who still wouldn't have been able to pull it off. I think this film and the whole event around it is what every blockbuster should try to achieve. It feels grand in nature, and it still lives up to expectations all these years later, and for that I'm giving it a 10 out of 10. Yet again, another movie that's judged way too harshly. Iron Man 3 was very good at taking a character like Iron Man and trying something different with him. Tony Stark barely spends any time in the Iron Man suit, which pissed a lot of people off. Couple that with the Mandarin twist, I could get why fans of the comics might not be too pleased, but within the logic of the film I think it works. Much like Shane Black's other movies, I think this film strikes a great balance between comedy and action.
Bend a few rules, maybe, but it's worth it. As long as you get the results.
That's a lot of blood. That's a lot of blood.
Maybe it just wasn't the balance fans were looking for after the Avengers, but for me, I love the much smaller, more intimate story told in this one. I love that we get to see Tony work under pressure, where I think he gets his best character moments. For that, I'm giving this film a 9 out of 10. What to say about For the Dark World? Chris Hemsworth is in it. 9 out of 10.
How do we know to...
Now here's the point where things start to get really good, where it seems like Marvel started letting directors do whatever they wanted. I love the change of pace for this film, taking cues from the Bourne films and every spy espionage movie of the past decade. This movie takes Captain America and truly modernises him, leaning heavier into politics than any other Marvel movie. I love how this movie makes Steve Rogers confront what America stands for, contrasting that with a friend from the past, the Winter Soldier. It sets up a great internal struggle for our hero. I also love the action in this movie. Quick cut action is hard to do well, and I think this movie pulls it off. Who would have expected that from the directors of Community? Overall, I'd give it a 9 out of 10.
I'm high on believing that you're in love with me.
Guardians of the Galaxy is one of the few superhero movies to ascend being one of my favourite superhero films, and just become one of my favourite movies of all time. I absolutely adore every element of this movie. In terms of tone, it's a complete polar opposite of The Winter Soldier. It's bright, fun, and a complete joyride of a movie. I can still remember most of the dialogue, it's so endlessly quotable. It helps that the lines are also brilliantly performed. Everybody in the cast does a great job. The chemistry between every character is hilarious to watch and grow over the course of the runtime. And do I need to talk about the soundtrack? It's easily one of the most memorable soundtracks of all time. So much so, a large amount of movies since have tried to replicate its charm, but so far nothing has even come close. It's also very easy to see the influence this movie had within the MCU, especially on a movie like Thor Ragnarok. I always think this is where Marvel is at its best. Give a small weird indie director 100 million and let them do whatever they want with it. I like the other Marvel movies, but for me it never got better than this. Therefore, this one definitely gets a 10 out of 10. Avengers 2 had a lot of expectation riding on it, and it does exactly that, meet expectations. Not by a large amount, but it still does it. This is another movie I don't have a lot to say about. It introduces us to Scarlet Witch, which is great, and it's never boring, so I'd give it a 9 out of 10. Ant-Man is fine. I wish we saw the Edgar Wright version, but this is okay. 9 out of 10. This movie should have been Avengers Age of Ultron. This movie isn't really a Captain America film, it's an Avengers film. I can definitely see why they gave the next two Avengers films to the Russo brothers after seeing this. The action is just as great as the Winter Soldier. It's cool seeing the Avengers using their powers against each other in interesting ways. And the conflict between the heroes feels believable. I know a lot of people wanted the conflict to be larger to match the scale in the comics, but I think this was the best way to do this story within the constraints of the MCU. It feels like more of a personal conflict than a civil war. I think these characters go big all the time. Seeing the fight be much more personal brought something that very few MCU movies do. Tony Stark and Steve Rogers' conflict felt tangible and believable, and that's why I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10. Another movie I don't have a lot to say about. It feels like Iron Man 1, too. But it looks super pretty. 9 out of 10. Still probably the most bizarre and unique movie in the MCU. It almost feels too bizarre to exist within the MCU. But I'm glad it does. It feels like James Gunn was really able to do whatever he wanted here. And it works. The structure of the movie itself feels very unconventional. With much of the plot taking place on a single planet, with no clear signs of conflict. Seeing a superhero movie take its time like this is very cathartic. Although I'm still not as big a fan of this one as I am the first one. I still think it's a very interesting route for a sequel to take, and adding Kurt Russell to anything is absolute genius. So this one gets a 9 out of 10. Is the third attempt at Spider-Man the best? Well, probably yes. I think it's definitely the best Peter Parker. Tom Holland is endlessly likeable, has that perfect mix of charming, funny and nerdy. The movie serves as a very good intro for our new Spider-Man. It's not absurdly ambitious, it feels like a bit of a warm-up for something bigger, but I do think it has one of the best twists within the MCU. Learning that Michael Keaton's Vulture was the father of one of the characters is one of my favourite moments within the MCU. This feels very much like something that would happen in the old 90s Spider-Man cartoon, or the old comics. Stan Lee would be proud. I'm giving this film a 9 out of 10. Now here's where the 4 franchise finally got good. This is 4 on acid, and in the best possible way. This movie is arguably the funniest out of the entire MCU, and that's all thanks to Taika Waititi. He does a great job kicking this character back into gear. I'd never realised how funny Chris Hemsworth was this whole time. It's also nice to see the Hulk injected with some personality. Everything here has much more personality. I'm glad to see that Chris Hemsworth is finally getting to do the character justice. And I'm sure Love and Thunder will be great. 9 out of 10. If I were to take outside politics into account, this would easily be Marvel's best movie, just for how much it means to so many people. It's great that even ignoring that, it's one of Marvel's best. The mixture of Afrofuturism and elements of the MCU merged to create Marvel's best looking movie from a production side. Combine that with a unique score that sounds like nothing else within the MCU. Like most other MCU movies, this is packed with great performances. Chadwick Boseman was a great Black Panther. He instantly became an idol to so many, and I hope they find a fitting way to continue his legacy. So this film gets a 10 out of 10. Infinity War is relentless in the best possible way. Relentless in the same way Mad Max Fury Road is. The film starts going 100 miles per hour and never slows down. Infinity War and Guardians of the Galaxy are the movies I go back and forth between as to which one is my favourite within the MCU. I'm still undecided. I think there are very few movies that have as perfect pacing as this movie. This movie feels 45 minutes long, but yet it feels epic and grand in nature. There's such a delicate balance, and the film straddles it constantly. It's also probably the only movie in the MCU where I genuinely thought anyone could die at any moment. It's not a feeling I often get in the MCU. It feels like the safety net has been taken off. It's one of those movies where nothing feels like it should work. There's so many different characters who crash tonally with others, yet they all bounce off each other so well. This also isn't really any of the main heroes' movies. The main following point of the film is Thanos, incredibly played by Josh Brolin. They did such a great job in making this villain a three-dimensional character, and not a caricature. The film uses Thanos as a jumping point around the universe to take us from character to character. And let's not forget that ending. What a perfect way to end the movie. There's a reason Infinity War and Endgame are the highest grossing films ever. This absolutely gets a 10 out of 10. I honestly don't have a lot to say about this one. It's pretty good. The shrinking effects are pretty good. And it's fun to see it used creatively. 9 out of 10. Not much here either. I like Brie Larson, and it's not a bad movie. Samuel L. Jackson's great. 9 out of 10. Here it is, the biggest movie event of all time. I don't even think you can describe this as a movie, because without the context of 20 other movies, this makes no sense. But that wasn't an accident. This entire movie is a third act. It's all payoff. And as a fan, I can see why this is everything you'd ever want from a Marvel movie. This film is a true roller coaster. Similar to Infinity War, the pacing here is perfect. The movie is close to 3 hours long, and you don't feel it for a second. It also gives some of this decade's most beloved characters perfect send-offs. The final shot of this movie is one of the most perfect resolutions for any character in cinema history. This is what made the other 20 movies worth it. Absolute 10 out of 10. This movie basically functions as an epilogue for what to come before it, but it feels like more of a final goodbye to the rest of the MCU than anything else. 9 out of 10. I've already reviewed this one, please take a look.